Hello, my name is Anvesh Rizal, and today I'm going to walk you through how to create a function in dataweave and how to externalize that. So to start out with, I have a very basic project. I have an HTTP endpoint that is listening on this endpoint called /DW, and I'm just basically going to take the payload, which is going to come in JSON, and just return it. Obviously, this is not doing anything, but we're going to make some enhancements to it. So the problem that we're looking to solve is, for instance, let's say my price on the value that comes in is in dollars, and then I want to convert it to pounds. Right? So a quick way to fix this problem is what I could do is I can come in here and define a var for, call it factor for conversion, and then we'll call it, give it a value of 1.3 as an example, right? So now I can come in and say, well, now my new price, right? My new price is going to be this. So this is a very simple example of how I'm going to take this, define a variable called factor, and then multiply that. So for me to test this, I can come in and quickly click on my preview button and play around with this a little bit to say if my price is $10, now I can see how my new price becomes $13, right? Now, which is fine, right? This is a very quick way to solve some of your problems, but sometimes these conversions are usually more complex, and we want to be able to reuse that. So the best way to solve the problem is to take this logic and externalize it on a file, right? In my case, I have a file in here called mylib.wav, which is where I've defined my conversion function. So let's take a look at that. So in here, I've actually defined a variable called exchange rate USD to pounds, and this is value 1.35. And then I have a function called conversion USD to pounds, which essentially does the same thing, takes my input value and then multiplies by that factor. So the one thing that you gotta note, potential gotcha, is for some of these functions, you need to define an external variable or external name for these functions. So I have a external name here, which is slightly shorter, which is called convert USD to pounds. Okay, so now that I have this library where I have this function defined with, in a more real world situation, much more, a lot more function definitions, what I could do is I can come back to this, and rather than hard coding this factor, actually I can define a variable. Let's call it my library or my lib, to represent my library. But in this case, this is going to actually use this specific keyword called read URL, and then it's going to read this, in my case, from my class path, which is going to be my root, and then /dw slash my lib.wav. Okay, so what this line basically just is saying is that, hey, go out and read this file, read this URL, right? Now, after it does that, it's going to have access to all the functions that I've defined. And now, instead of hard coding this in here, I could now say, well, I'm going to reference my newly created variable, my lib, and it has this method. It has this function called convert USD to pounds, and use that, pass that in. Right? So essentially what I'm doing here is, instead of hard coding that multiplication factor, I'm calling this function, which is defined my external library, called mylib.wav, right? And that guy basically comes in here and say, okay, this represents this function, which is defined over here, which is where I take my input and multiply that by this factor 1.35. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. And then now I can come in here and save this and do a quick preview, and right there I can see this is the $10 for my payload over here, or I can change this to 100. A value of 100 is actually being converted into 135 based on that conversion factor that's defined in my external file. So this is a very basic example, but a common use of something like this is when you need to do, date time conversions or some of these components that you're doing in multiple location. It doesn't make sense to hard code them within your or include them within your project. It's easier if you can define this on a library and then reference them. It becomes much more reusable. And then it makes it easier for newer folks to come in into your team as well, because now they can just call the libraries of your function that you've defined and be able to create these flows much more faster. The last thing I could do now is still go back to my post and send it again, and I can see how now this value gets converted into 135 over here. I didn't realize it was the same number. If I change this to 50 as an example, it converts it into my new price. Hopefully this makes sense. Thanks for watching.